Hello, Rhonda here. Good day and happy January 2nd, 2025. Today I'm reading from, excuse me, part 4.4 Christians and Their Myth. This is from the book The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack. Christians and Their Myth. The discovery of Q may create some consternation for Christians because accepting Q's challenge is not merely a matter of revising a familiar chapter of history. It is a matter of being forced to acknowledge an affair with one's own mythology. The disclosure of a myth is deemed academic as long as the myth belongs to somebody else. Recognizing one's own myth is always much more difficult, if not downright dangerous. The reason for this is the way myths work, they're magic. Myths are guardians of cultural identity and work best when taken for granted. Left undisturbed, a myth makes it possible to assume that others agree in advance on the rules that govern the daily round. Should a myth ever be named and questioned, the collective agreements basic to a society's well being come unglued and people feel unsettled. The Christian myth is particularly vulnerable. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold here. The Christian myth is particularly vulnerable to unsettling questions. Most myths take place once upon a time in an irreal world. Like all stories, they allow the listener to suspend judgment while watching the story unfold. Christian myth claims to be a history and asks its adherents to believe that it is true. As long as there is no other data from which to construct a different account of the same chapter of history, the Christian myth can work much the same way as other myths. Christians can simply bracket the story of Jesus from the rest of human history and treat it as an exceptional moment, realizing that the events recorded are fantastic, but allowing the story to stand. If, however, the history yields to other explanations and the fantastic features of the Gospels are explained as mythic, the Christian gospel will be in very deep trouble, and Christian mentality will have to renegotiate both its real and imaginary worlds. That is exactly where Q enters the picture. Q challenges the New Testament account of Christian origins by offering another, more plausible account of the first 40 years. The Jesus movement is a more believable group of people than the disciples and first Christians who are depicted in the narrative Gospels. Q provides a documentation for the Jesus movement that the narrative Gospels cannot provide for the congregational fiction they project. This is serious business because the gospel story is the cornerstone of the Christian's mythic world. Christians understand the gospel as the story of events that generated the Christian church and invite personal imitation. The gospel functions as the source for the special knowledge Christians claim, as the cluster of symbols that focus Christian meditation and as the script for ritual reenactment in both individual experience and congregational liturgy. The gospel is firmly in mind in Western culture. It is the story that has determined the shape of Christian mentality. When Christians recall the gospel story, they do not think of four distinct narrative accounts, but of an amalgam of the four stories. For nearly 2,000 years, these stories have been merged in the iconography and liturgical rehearsals of the church. The church has never been bothered by having four different accounts of the same story. Each account has been regarded merely as another telling according to a different witness or apostle. The invitation to merge the four Gospels into one Gospel story is integral to the design of the New Testament. When during the 4th century the writings to be used in Christian congregations became widely available in a single codex or manuscript, a conceptual fusion took place that effectively effaced the huge ideological differences among the various writings. From that time on, the four Gospels collapsed into a single narrative world of the life of Christ according to the bishop's myth. Excuse me. The letters took their subsequent place as the apostolic interpretation of that single gospel story. It is this coalescence of disparate writings that justifies speaking in the singular about the gospel as Christians imagine it. Thus, the New Testament was not put together as an ad hoc collection of writings for the purpose of conserving the early records of Christian beginnings. It consisted of a highly select set of writings carefully arranged. The criteria for selection and arrangement were discussed in the preceding chapter, including the observation that the selection represented several streams of Christian persuasion and reveals the bishop's desire to fashion from them a universal church. We can now ask about the consequences of that strategy for the Christian imagination. What the bishops achieved in putting together that unlikely collection of writings, whether it worked for them according to their institutional plans or not, was an astounding literary success. Their selection became the New Testament, and the New Testament became the textual foundation for Christian myth and ritual in all of its many manifestations. Notice how the apostolic myth supports the merger of all the writings into one account of Christian origins. If the four narrative Gospels differ merely because they are the accounts of four different disciples, and if the letters were all written by disciples who became apostles, the various preachments throughout the New Testament are bound to have weight as formulations made during the apostolic period. This really means mythically that witnesses, quote unquote, to Jesus recorded their experiences soon after his death and resurrection. It works. The selection and arrangement of writings in the New Testament project a single history and make of the general writings one. In the New Testament project a single history and make of the several writings one book. Given this arrangement, it has all but impossible to read the narrative Gospels in any other light than that provided by the apostolic interpretations of the significant events. Even Mark would be read now through the eyes of Peter and Paul. What irony! We have seen that Mark combined martyrological motifs from Paul's Christ myth with various traditions about Jesus from the Jesus movement in order to write this gospel. Excuse me. This combination produced the Passion narrative, a novel interpretation of Jesus' death that did not agree with the views of either tradition he used, but now included as one of the Gospels in the New Testament. The differences between Mark and his sources could no longer be seen. Mark would be read as a witness to the synoptic story on a par with the other three evangelists, even though each of the other three had gotten their start from Mark and had changed his story to agree with their own views. Mark's passion narrative would be interpreted in agreement with Paul's kerygma, not as a correction of it. Both Paul and Mark would be read as witnesses to the same Christ event, and both of their interpretations would coalesce in its layered meaning. The effect of this phenomenon has been deep, lasting, and profound. All of the writings in the New Testament have been read as witnesses to the story of Christian beginnings that was created from the merger of these very same writings. The result has been that each writing has been read as one interpretation of the common underlying story, and that the many interpretations have turned the story into a richly nuanced, multi-layered symbol. Two events are especially important for the Christian imagination, and these have become places in the story where the fusion of multiple and conflictual meanings is most dense. A brief description of how these two events were overlaid with connotation will prepare us for a final meditation on the radical nature of Q's challenge to the Christian mind. The first event is the death of Jesus. Two enrichments of its significance occurred that are absolutely fundamental for Christian myth and ritual. One is that by reading the story of Jesus' death in light of the Pauline kerygma, the passion of Jesus became the sign of his willingness to sacrifice himself for the salvation of the world. This meaning was not a part of Mark's story. The other event of significance is the Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples, overlaid with charismatic and sacrificial theology drawn from the reinterpretation of the Passion narrative. The Last Supper became the Lord's Supper, an act charged with symbolic significance by pointing to Jesus' self-sacrifice on the cross. The supper story could now be read as Jesus' acknowledgement of the deep meaning of his death, the Christian myth, and used as a script for ritual reenactment, the Christian liturgy. At some point not earlier than the 3rd or 4th century, a priest actually stepped in to take Jesus' place at the table, and the Christian Mass or Eucharist was created. Mark had not told the story of the supper in order to institute the Christian Eucharist. That does not mean that meeting together for meals was not the normal practice for Christian congregations from the earliest times. Meals were certainly the occasion for gathering in the Jesus movements and congregations in the Christ cults. But not all meals were memorials of Jesus' death, and none were ritual occasions on the model of the later Eucharist. The tradition Paul cites in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 26, was not a script for reenactment, but an etiological legend with pedagogic intent. The instructions for a meal in the Didache, a meal of thanksgiving for the knowledge Jesus had given the community about their belonging to the people of God, does not refer to the death and resurrection of Jesus at all. And Mark's Last Supper was not yet the Lord's Supper. So the Eucharist, as a reenactment of the sacrificial death of Jesus, evolved later, slowly and by degrees. The Christian Eucharist created a mimetic imagination capable of marvelous mental gymnastics. Christians could now experience the first time at other times. Christians could now be present at the sacred place in other places. Christians could participate in the drama of the sacred event by participation in its symbolic reenactment. And so the stories recorded in the New Testament turned into icons for the visual representation of the sacred drama within the precincts of the medieval church. As objects of meditation, these narrative images became the occasion for mimetic transformation into the imaginary world over which the church presided. The New Testament became the myth and the ritual text for a world religion. The Jesus movement, represented by Q, is hardly a match for Christianity as a world religion. Even after the development of an essentially timeless, imaginary universe, best expressed in the visual form of triptychs, the Bible still functioned as the textual record and authorization of the events to be memorialized and reenacted on liturgical occasions. With the Bible repositioned by the Reformers and the notion of history given privilege in the Enlightenment Academy, the claim of the Church on the gospel as history finally surfaced as an important question. It is in this arena, the arena for understanding the relation between myth and history, that Q registers its challenge. The challenge will have to be taken seriously because Q is integral to the history of the formation of the Gospels. Had Q been discovered as an independent text extraneous to the New Testament, such as the Gospel of Thomas, or as a separate writing within the New Testament, such as the letter of James, it might be discounted as a document from some mistaken heretical side branch of the true Christian tradition. But Q is foundational to the very composition of the narrative Gospels. Take Q away and they fall into fragments without narrative or instructional significance. A remarkable irony can serve as a final observation on the nature of Q's challenge from within the New Testament. Q was not only essential to the Gospels as a source for the teachings of Jesus, or as a precursor mythology upon which the narrative Gospels were built. In the course of developing their mythology at the Q2 level, the authors of Q used a clever intertextual reference that caught the attention of the authors of the Gospels and eventually determined by the logic of which not only the Gospels but also the New Testament canon were linked to the Hebrew scriptures to form the Christian Bible. This textual reference was the use of the Malachi citation to predict the appearances of John and Jesus. It has been mentioned that Mark made programmatic use of the John-Jesus story to introduce his gospel, and that Matthew and Luke followed Mark and embellished his account. Mark used the Malachi citation, Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, in combination with a forceful prediction from Isaiah about a voice crying in the wilderness, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, to introduce John at the very beginning of his story. Matthew and Luke undid this combination using the Isaianic prediction to introduce John at the appropriate point toward the beginning of their stories, while reserving the Malachi prediction for its proper enunciation by Jesus, just as Q had it. Matthew chapter 11, verse 10, Luke chapter 7, verse 27. We can now make the observation that these references to Malachi help determine the structure of the Christian Bible. During the period of canon formation, the early Christian writings were not the only scriptures of importance to the church. The epic literature of Israel was also under constant discussion as a record of the history of divine intention that Jesus and the church fulfilled. The Christian claim to novelty could only be forceful if its recent origin could be seen as the perfection of ancient ideas. But of course, the Hebrew scriptures belonged to the Jews, not to the Christians. Thus, the Christian appropriation of the Epic of Israel became an issue of fundamental significance for the church. It had to be read as a story that somehow anticipated the Christ, and it had to be arranged to interlock with the New Testament. In the process of making the Hebrew epic one's own, Christians rearranged the order in which the Hebrew scriptures occurred in the Jewish Bible. The Jewish order was first the law, or Torah, the 5 books of Moses, then the prophets, including the early prophets from Joshua through the histories of Samuel and the Kings, and finally the writings, including the Psalms, the so-called wisdom literature, Esther and Daniel. Of great significance is that the Postexilic, I'm sure I didn't say that right. It's spelled Postexilic. Is that the apostolic histories of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Chronicles were placed among the writings at the very end of the collection. Thus, the Jewish epic ends with the edict of Cyrus about building a house for the Lord in Jerusalem and the call to all the Lord's people to go up. Christians reversed the order of the prophets and the writings in order to end with Malachi. Eureka! One reads the Hebrew epic to the end, reads about the messenger to come, turns the page, and hears the voice of John, or Jesus, saying that Malachi's prophecy is coming to pass. What a neat connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the arrangement of the writings in the New Testament, any of the 3 synoptic gospels could have been placed first to gain this same effect. But Luke and Matthew would have been the most likely candidates for first position because they were more compatible with the church's instructions than Mark. Matthew's gospel was, in any case, the preferred gospel for citations of the teachings of Jesus, and Luke's gospel properly belonged closer to its sequel, the Acts of the Apostles. In parentheses, John's gospel did not fit well into the epic apostolic logic of the arrangement, and so was placed last of the 4, even though his separated Luke's gospel from his Acts. And so the story of Q's legacy reaches beyond the appropriation of Q by Matthew to end with Matthew's favored status as the first book in the New Testament. Q had provided the very logic by which the Old and New Testaments were linked together in the making of the Christian Bible. What a legacy, and what a discovery! We are now ready to ask about Q's chances for making the difference in the modern world. And that finishes up part 4.4, Christians and Their Myth, read from the book The Lost Gospel, The Book of Q and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack, 1993. Stay tuned because the next chapter next part will be entitled The Consequences. So good day, and thank you for listening.